Okay, Into the West, second shot. First time I did this, it was entirely too long and boring. So I'm going to try to make it a little bit more interesting, okay? Into the West. This covers the period where a lot of the Americans who were living on the East Coast decided to move into the central part of the United States because there was a lot of land there. Now that the Civil War was over, people wanted to kind of find a new home and a new territory, and this interior of the United States was absolutely perfect. There was one problem: getting there. So the big idea that they came up with was the idea of a transcontinental railroad. There was huge railroad networks all throughout the eastern part of the United States, but they wanted railroads that would get all the way to the West Coast because California was already a state and everything else was kind of a territory. So they came up with this idea to build transcontinental railroads. It was supported by the government, paid for by the government, and of course, big business. Two companies started. One started here in St. Louis called the Central Pacific. It started at the Mississippi River and it built westward. On the California coast, the Union Pacific starts in California and builds east. Now, they had the harder job. These people just had to build across all the flatlands in the middle, but the Union Pacific had to cross two mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevadas and the Rockies, and they also had a labor problem. In the east, they had lots of people living in the east which needed a job: Irish immigrants, freedmen who came up from the south, a lot of people that just wanted a job. On the west coast, they ended up importing thousands of Chinese laborers who, when they got here, worked on the railroad and then faced horrible discrimination because of that. So the Union Pacific was building this way, the Central Pacific was building this way, and in May of 1869, they meet up at a place called Promontory, Utah, and they drive a literal golden spike into where these train tracks actually met. This symbolized that the United States was now completely tied together, opening up this entire land for settlement. And by 1890, 8 new states had been created by all this territory. They then built railroads across the northern tier and across the southern tier, and branch lines running north and south in order to populate this entire area. You see, railroads cost money, but railroads make money, lots of money. And wherever the railroads went, towns would spring up all along the railroad lines. And in order to get that done, the government gave land to the railroads, a 10-mile wide corridor on both sides of the railroad tracks, totaling 180 million acres of free land that the railroads could then go ahead and sell at a profit because railroads make money. Now, you got transportation, you got land, all you need was people. So the government came up with an interesting idea. They called it the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was a promise that if you moved your family onto a chunk of land and would stay there for a certain amount of years, they would give you 160 acres of land for free. And you could farm it, you could raise sheep on it, you could do just about anything with it. It was free. One example of the Homestead Act was something called the Oklahoma Land Rush, and that was in 1889. The entire Oklahoma Territory used to be Native American reservations, more about them in a minute, and so the government came in, cleaned those people off, and opened up almost the entire state of Oklahoma to settlement. There were 100,000 people lined up at the border of Arkansas and Oklahoma, and when they shot a gun, 100,000 people went whipping across the territory, grabbing up to 2 million acres of land for free. Now, the people that went to settle Oklahoma, when they heard the boom of the gun, they rushed off to get what they could. They were called boomers. But there were others who had hidden there, and they were called Sooners because they got there sooner. And that's why the Oklahoma football team is called the Sooners. Now, conflict with Native Americans, as you can perfectly imagine. You remember the Trail of Tears we talked about in North Carolina, where they threw out all the Cherokee and Choctaw Indians and made them go to Oklahoma? Well, then they had to get rid of them out of Oklahoma. And they had to get rid of them out of a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of places, because more white folks moving in, there was more pressure to get the Native Americans out. They signed all kinds of treaties, and probably one of the worst ones was called the Fort Laramie Treaty. The Fort Laramie Treaty set aside a huge chunk of what is now Colorado and Nebraska and places like that, and the language of the treaty was this: this would be Indian land as long as the grass grown, until gold was discovered. When gold is discovered, more white folk move in, Native Americans gotta go. And this led to something called the Sand Creek Massacre, where a group of white citizens ganged up and attacked a Native American village and massacred about 150 men, women, and children, killed them all dead. This, of course, led to armed resistance by the Native Americans, primarily two tribes, the two largest tribes, the Sioux Indians and the Cheyenne. The leader of the Sioux was a guy by the name of Chief Sitting Bull. The guy leader of the Cheyenne was a Chief Crazy Horse, two very famous names in American history. Now, one part of the armed resistance was an interesting religious festival they had called Ghost Dancers. And the warriors that would participate in these ghost dancers believed that by dancing around and having their priests pray and do magic incantations, that they would be spiritually protected as warriors. In fact, some of them even were told that wearing the special ghost dance shirts would make them bulletproof. Not quite. However, they did pull off a major victory. At the Little Bighorn, which is in South Dakota, a U.S. Army colonel leading a cavalry group called Colonel Custer, he fought in the American Civil War. He had about 200 cavalry with him, and he decided to try and take on what he thought was a small group of Sioux warriors. And it turns out that there was over 2,500 Sioux warriors just over the next hill. And so he rides down into the valley, and he chases a few of these Indians. He gets to the top of the next hill, and it's like, oh my gosh, I've never seen so many Native Americans in one place. He retreats back, they come over, kill them almost all. Almost every single one of these 200 soldiers died in that battle. Now, this just led to an increased military presence in the plains, and the U.S. Army decided that they were going to bust the chops of Sitting Bull and Chief Crazy Horse. And they fought numerous battles in the American West in order to stop the Indians, culminating in something called the Wounded Knee Massacre. A lot of the Indian warriors had been called off into battle, and so there was a small village called Wounded Knee, and it had more or less 200 older men, but mostly women and children, and the cavalry comes in and just kills every single last one of them in revenge for the loss at Little Bighorn. Following this, the Native American armed resistance kind of stopped. And then the U.S. government decided that they were going to finally do something with the Indians, and they passed something called the Dawes Act. Now, the Dawes Act kind of sounded like a good idea. And what they wanted was something called assimilation. Assimilation is when an ethnic group kind of comes into a larger group of a nationality, and they just kind of start to marry in, and they kind of blend in, and pretty soon they're not really there. It's kind of what happened to, the Welsh or the Irish that came into, they kind of accepted American culture. The idea was that the Native Americans would be assimilated into American culture. They wouldn't be Indians anymore. And the way they were going to do that? Schools. They set up schools, but not just the kind of schools like we go to where you live at home and you come to school and then you go home. What they did was they did boarding schools, where the government would take the Indian children away from their parents, make them live at these government schools, forbid them from speaking their native language, forbid them from dressing in whatever native costumes or uniforms they were wearing, forbid them from practicing their religion, forbid them from contacting their parents and all their kinfolk. And the idea is that if you get them in school, you can change their ideas, teach them English, teach them how to, be like an American, teach them to worship different types of religions, as long as it had anything to do with Indians. Assimilation. And eventually those Native American children would kind of stop being Native Americans and would kind of act like everybody else. And this, in fact, is an example of what's called cultural genocide, when the government deliberately decided to do away with Native American culture. It didn't work. Thank goodness for that.
Ms. Hardison, please call 4-3.